Only other time I'll be available is to end the program.
Okay,
So
cool.
that's us today.
All right.
You have graphs and so on?
Um, I want to push up a graph.
All right.
You can allow it.
I know.
If not, I'll just talk about it.
Good. Let's talk. I got something else to do.
So there's something you just gotta do to push the graph through.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, all right. I'll just talk about it if you're not there.
All right, we live. So keep your peace now.
Mm.
One day I met an old woman selling, and I wanted something to eat. I say I was going to put a bit in Chile, but I checked back when I meet. I thought she had bananas, orange or pears, but was nothing that I need. But when I asked the old woman what she was selling, she said she was selling weed. She had the coat tie up over her waist and was stepping along with grace. She had on a pair of old clogs on her feet and was wiggling down the street. Just then she started to name the different kind of weeds, and I really was more than glad. But I can't remember all that she called, but these were a few she had. Man piaba, woman piaba, tan fall back and lemongrass. Milly root, dolly root, granny backbone, bitter tally, lime leaf and turo. Coolie bitters, corilla bush, flatter the earth and iron weed. Sweet brown function, wild daisy, sweet sage and even toyo. The hot cat with shining in soldier rod, pasture lana and cowfoot bush, milkweed, milkweed, porcine, man's bush, bishop cat, and rock balsam, Suriname bitters, wild green tea, tree finger, and warm bush. Fed grass farmers carry for bush, snake bitters and also tisans. She had cassava mama, oku piaba, Jacob's ladder and kitty guana, finger bush, joke, stare, bitty bay, jumbie basil and white berry, file bush, wild cane, duckweed and the seed, warra bitters and wild grey root. She even had them to a certain bush, a bait in the skull, puss in boots.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our ninth edition of Health Inside Out. Remember, this show is grown out of the need for information, interaction, and a man in the street knowledge into the health issues affecting Guyana. Today, we have a special host. But before I get on to that, this show is brought to you live by CAMS TV, which is a community sponsored telecast. Remember, CAMS TV is accepting donations. So the operator will place the Zelle accounts on the screen, so please contribute. And when you're contributing, ensure that you're mentioning Health Inside Out show. We talked about the scourge of mental health in Guyana. And so myself and a few other folks, including Anton Queckwell, we've decided to play a role in reducing mental illness in Guyana. So 100% of the funds will go towards our mental health community outreach. We know it's a new year. Last year we weren't very successful, but this year we're also pushing for business sponsorship. So if you have a business and you would like to sponsor on the Health Inside Out show, please feel free to reach out to me. My number is +1 443 509 6166. Again, all these funds are going towards our mental health community outreach program. And the operator will also put my number in the bottom so that we can discuss, particularly when it comes to the end of our show, our Man in the Street segment, where we take question and answers from you We're also streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. So you can also put your questions there as well. Today, we're kicking off with an interesting topic. We're going to talk about economic development, mental health, and we're going to also talking about the relation between that and the diaspora. We have an interesting guest today. But before we get into that, let's talk about economic development. So according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, economic development is the process of improving a country's economy and the quality of life for people. It includes creating jobs, increasing access and opportunities, increasing living standards, increasing income, ensuring that there's income equality, education, and also healthcare. So, there is a direct correlation there. Economic development includes things like energy supply. You're talking about the power issues we're having in Guyana with GPL. That's part of economic development. It affects productivity. It affects numerous things. Technology as well, with computers, access to jobs. People's earning capacity, food, water, education, healthcare, housing. Again, we can never talk about economic development without talking about healthcare, because healthcare provides that fundamental bridge towards the economic status of communities, transforming those that are impoverished to those that are developed. But what are the stages of economic development? How do we arrive to where we are today? So there are several different models for economic development. There is what's called Rostow's and Porter's 4 stages, or 5 stages rather, which basically talks about a traditional society where it's based on agriculture, extractive industries, which is things like your gold, diamond, bauxite, and so forth. And the workforce is mainly unskilled. So that's a traditional society. There's a next stage where there's preconditions to take off, which includes science, technology, and the investment in infrastructure, because, coupled with agriculture, that, pivots over the economic and start to set the economy for takeoff. Then we have takeoff, which is rapid economic growth in a few key industries. You have steel, railroads, textile, food production. And I'm sure that you guys would, in Guyana, we would recognize a lot of these, because we had industries such as bauxite, gold, and things of that nature. We made garments and so forth. And so that drove economic development, but that was only the takeoff, right? Then we had a drive towards maturity. So as the economy matures, it begins to diversify and your workforce becomes a little more skilled. And then there's the age of high mass consumption. That means that the economy shifts from heavy industries to customer goods and services. And I think as a country, we're somewhere behind that takeoff and drive towards maturity. But also we must note that when we're talking about economic development, we must look at the key indicators for economic development. So how do we arrive and you would hear things like GDP and interest rates, credit rating, and inflation. And we'll talk about that. We're saying we're the fastest growing country in the world right now, based on GDP, which is the size of the economy at the time. So GDP measures the value of goods and services. So, whether you're buying a washing machine or you're buying milk, whatever you buy, those goods and services that you have, even taking a haircut or going to the hairdresser, or even repairs by your plumber, that all, funnel into economic development, because that's goods and services. You go to get a haircut, that's a service that's been provided, you pay, they collect the money. That increases economic development. If you go to the market and you buy a pound of milk, you're using money there. And so that is also driving economic development. There are 2 types of GDP. There is what's called a nominal GDP, which is the total value of a country's goods and services, and the current prices. So you're paying $200 a liter for gas, you're paying $600 a pound of milk, you're paying $400 for a pound of beef. And so that nominal GDP is used to compare the national economies and international market. And then there's what's called the PPP, which is not the party PPP, but is the purchasing parity. And what that does, it's the total monetary value of a country's goods and services produced at the purchasing power parity prices. And when they're converted to US dollars and divided by the population, the GDP now is useful for comparing standards of living. So you would have heard that the average money by average Guyanese has gone up now from, in 2014, 2015, we were a nation that were making anywhere between 6,000 to 7,000. And now they're saying within the last 7 years, because of the economic development, we're now at a $25,000 earning power per person. And sometimes that could be miscued because, like we discussed with oil and gas industry. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the interest rates are another important thing, because that affects how much you pay for something. So when you go to borrow, a loan from the bank, that adds to the principal, which is how much you actually want to pay for something. And that interest rate is noted on an annual basis, which is called the APR. Then you have a credit rating, which now says, your ability by a corporation or a government to repay your debt. How well can you repay a debt? And credit ratings for governments are usually monitored by places like Global, S&P Global, Moody's, Fitch Ratings, things like that. Corporations like that, they're looking at credit ratings used by investors who want to know the risk of buying bonds or other debt instruments by these entities. And then we have inflation. So inflation, we've heard a lot about this all throughout the world, all throughout the pandemic. It's the rate of increase in prices over a period of time. It's usually a broad measure, such as the overall prices that affects the cost of living. But it can be narrowly calculated for certain things like goods and services, like let's say a haircut. I remember one time I used to pay $700 for a haircut in Guyana. Now I'm paying $2,500, almost $3,000. And so you see that price is now inflated. And then you go to the barber shop, the man will tell you, well, this got expensive, that got expensive. And so that is driving the costs and prices up. Now, in Guyana, we're talking about what is our economic indicators? What is driving all of this massive growth? So our inflation in Guyana right now is about 4.5 to 5.5% this year. Also, you'll be seeing that that the GDP it was $22.9 billion in 2024, and it's projected to be $24.4 billion. And again, it's due to this rapid increase of the oil and gas industry. While we do not have a credit rating as a nation, the World Bank has said that our ability to repay debt is moderate, which means that, at 22.7%, it shows that Guyana's debt is about 22.7% compared to its ability to earn money and pay. So we're talking about economic development today, and the reason why I'm talking about that will make the correlation between mental health and the diaspora. But we'll take this time to talk about our guest today. Our guest is Dr. Lear Matthews. He is the Professor Emeritus, Community and Human Service, State of New York, and a former lecturer at the University of Guyana. He's also an executive board member of the Association of Caribbean Social Work Educators and a member of the editorial board of the Caribbean Journal of Social Work. He served as the clinical director of the Bedford-Stuyvesant Community Mental Health Center, New York, and has written extensively on the adaptation of immigrants with a focus on the Caribbean diaspora. His latest paper, Anticipating Economic Prosperity in Guyana, Time to Invest in Mental Health, and Investing in Mental Health Care in Guyana, Essentializing Cultural Competent Intervention, we will delve into these two work of him and talk about bridging the gap between mental illness, economic development, and what the role of the diaspora can play. So, without further ado, let's bring Dr. Matthews in to our show. Dr. Matthews?
Come up to this room.
Hey,
Hi.
Dr.
All right. You hearing me now?
Yes, I
Okay,
can
great.
hear you loud and clear. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, and good evening, all. That was very good introduction in terms of the topic. Not so much about me, but the topic. Okay, so thanks for inviting me, first of all. And I'm happy that you clearly defined economic development, what economic development means. Usually, economic development goes along with social development. The two are interlocked in any societal process or development. So you defined economic development. I'm going to take a shot at, minimally defining social development. Social development is a process of an individual learning how to interact with others, build relationships, understand social cues, develop skills necessary for functioning effectively within a society or community.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the importance of the connection between economic development and social development. So I just wanted to bring that forward. Okay, so as Colin said, I wrote 2 articles on mental health and development. And my interest in mental health in Guyana peaked when I saw the World Health Organization's report on the increased rate of suicide in Guyana several years ago, particularly among youth. I subsequently wrote these 2 articles connecting mental health with social and economic development. And we'll get into that more soon.
Certainly.
Yeah.
So I wanted to back up a little bit more about your bio. So your bio suggests that you're an educator, a clinician, being a social worker, and you've also written extensively about the diaspora. What has prompted your career in mental health? And also, how did you arrive at this love affair that you have, with your work with talking about the diaspora and writing extensively about the diaspora?
Yeah. For mental health, it's both personal and professional. My youngest sister was diagnosed as mentally retarded back in Guyana. And, back in the day, we didn't have the facilities to deal with many of these, that type of diagnosis. And so I became interested and I wondered about what if we had the services at the time back then to help my sister better. And so we had to care for her and so on. And once I came to the United States, I vowed to, I started in social work in Guyana. And then I went to the University of Puerto Rico, where I did sociology and social work. But the reason for me to getting into social work has to do with my experience with caring for my sister. Right? So that's my story based on that in terms of what motivated me. And once I came to New York, I went to social work school and I developed my skills, did some practice in social work in the Bed-Stuy section. It's kind of a rough neighborhood. So that's how I got into it. Okay, so as I said, my interest in mental health peaked when I saw the World Health Organization report on the increased rate of suicide in Guyana. I think it was like about 4 years ago, Colin. Remember?
Yeah.
With that report.
Yeah, I think around 20, between 20, it's about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. And I found it very disturbing and really outstanding in terms of the rate and what was going on in Guyana at the time. And these statistics pertain particularly to the youth of Guyana. And and I subsequently wrote these articles looking at some of the issues relating to youth suicide and the not only the rate, but looking at some of the facilities. How did the government, how did communities react to that? All right,
Mhm.
there was very little effective intervention that I found. My goal was to first of all acknowledge the problem. One, the extent and awareness of the problem. I think this is the first thing that we need to think of when we're looking at a social or psychological problem or issue. What's the extent? How widespread it is, and what how is the community or the society aware of it? What's their awareness level of awareness? Um, Two, the importance of adopting what I call a culturally competent intervention approach. Because often, especially in so called developing countries, we
Mhm.
tend to borrow approaches and intervention strategies from the developed world, and sometimes it doesn't fit.
Correct.
So we have to be very careful in terms of whatever intervention we adopt, it should be it should be defined by what's called cultural competent approach. Things like understanding and respect for cultural values, traditional customs, beliefs, myths, taboos, and overcoming fears. All of these things are very important in the process of intervening effectively. I may be some of these things, as I say some of these things, I may be preaching to the choir, but hear me out. Um, Without some or all of these considerations I just mentioned, there are likely to be barriers in the helping process. Simply, it is also important to recognize the need to understand the ripple effect of vulnerabilities. What do I mean by that? How certain groups in society, such as the mentally ill, homeless, those viewed as pavement dwellers, uh, disabled, those with substance abuse disorders, even seniors, and other marginalized groups, they tend to be ostracized, um, evident by lack of resources and general disinterest in their welfare. And this is something that many societies are guilty of, even today. Um, they're often labeled and targeted. The mantra, I would say, survival of the fittest, seems in full force when it comes to the mentally ill and other differently abled people in society. Um, Survival of the fittest. It's like we don't pay much attention to these folks. It's like almost they're in some cases they're dehumanized. Although I may be, as I said, preaching to the choir here, I wanted to reemphasize that people with mental health problems and those on the cusp of psychological distress should not be ridiculed, treated with indifference, or punished. And sometimes we see this kind of reaction to people who are mentally ill. They can't defend themselves, and so they're ridiculed and they're treated with indifference or sometimes punished. And we think of the pavement people, as we would call them, for example. Many of those folks are mentally ill. Uh,
Correct.
right.
I just wanna, so for us to zoom in a little bit more, on, and we're gonna get to some of this, the issues here, but the latest data shows in 2024, last budget, we spent about 11% on healthcare. It's an increase from 6% in 2020. So in 2021, it was 5%. The WHO says 5% is, normally the standard for expenditure. And you would think that there's also smaller portions directed to mental health. So do you believe that we can spend more on mental illness outside of the healthcare budget, given we have this large windfall of cash now from oil and gas?
Oh, definitely, definitely, and that should be seriously considered, because mental health should be seen as part of health care, and it is part of health care. But somehow, traditionally, we tend to focus on physical health and physical medicine rather than mental health. So I think the awareness is important. I'm going to talk a little bit about, introducing this topic in schools also. Very, very important. So yes, definitely, there should be more expenditure for mental health.
Let's dive into your article. So Article 1, which talks about anticipating economic prosperity in Guyana, time to invest in mental health. You noted this, and this is a direct quote from you.
Yeah.
Nation building needs to steady hands and sound minds across ethnic, racial, and religious and social spectrum. This is a reasonable gauge of civil society reaching its full potential. Human capital, that is, the economic value of people's experiences, skills, and expertise, is diminished by mental and emotional stress. We're approximately losing about 300 people on a yearly basis to self-harm or other mental illness. If you calculate that at the GDP per capita, which is like around $25,000 a year, every time we lose 300 people, we're losing about 7.5 million US dollars, or about $1.5 billion lost to our GDP. Is this acceptable?
It's certainly not. Certainly not. And I definitely think to your earlier point that there should definitely be more investment in mental health. And it should be seen within the broad definition of health care. And the difference between having a healthy physical health and mental health population is so important. Yeah, definitely. There should be a larger expenditure.
Okay. And, picking up where you left off in Article 2, you talk about this reciprocal relationship that is existing between economic development and psychosocial well-being of a nation. Can you provide some insights into this notion for us?
Yes, my point was that in order for people, psychological problems and mental illness is in a way similar to physical illnesses because it incapacitates people. And the incapacitation is not as visible as with physical distress or illnesses. So if a society is not attending to the psychological functioning or the mental health of its citizens, then and we know what handicaps mental health can create. Their ability to focus, right? In order to be productive, you have to focus. Ability to make rational decisions, and all of these things would impact one's ability to be a productive individual, not only for self and family, but in terms of the impact on society, the collective impact on society. Right? People who are mentally ill and those who are considered, not being able to function adequately in society for whatever reasons, are in a sort of a visible, invisible situation. They're seen, but they're invisible. they're invisible to the extent that they're not seen as being productive part of society, right? Because of their quote unquote handicap. So,
Right.
so definitely there's that the problem of producing. And one of the things is that it's okay to talk about building roads and highways and buildings and housing and so on and so on. That's
Correct.
important. But when it comes to as important would be building the strength and the both emotional and physical strength. I don't mean be bodybuilders or anything like that, but
Right.
emotional strength um, is important in terms of um, um, contributing to the growth of society. Because if just as if a person is physically ill, when they're mentally ill, they cannot produce as much. So it's a simple link. It's a logical link, I think. But the problem is that it's not seen in that way. So, in other words, a healthy society is a productive society. A healthy being defined in terms of both physical health and emotional health. So that's the connection, definitely.
Yeah, because what we do is I think for a long period of time we've sort of try to look at people who are mentally ill, right? Sort of an outcast to society,
Yes.
and not only for mental illnesses. I mean, it applies to we've talked about epilepsy on
Yes.
the show. We've talked about people with HIV. We've talked about people with other. We're going to talk about people with disabilities as well. So we've often looked at them as sort of um, this scorn to society, that these things like cancer and COVID and mental illnesses and disabilities is somewhat like an issue that these people have looked for, and or some cultures. I've had Antoine Craig while he was on the show talked about, some people talk about the fact that you do something bad and so bad following you now. So you have these kind of competing areas of difficulties where there's misconceptions that people who have disease or disabilities, that is their fault. And so we also
Blame the victim, right? Yeah.
yeah, we tend to exclude them from the economic matrix, right?
Yes.
We just, they normally resorted to, some people resort to homelessness. A lot of people we're seeing today in the world, that they're out there homeless. And as you know, homelessness now is an all-time high in America. I think it's like, what, 15% now? Because of a lot of these come from those preconceived notions. Some of it is rooted in ignorance, in terms of whether somebody who has a particular condition can still function. And you and I, we live in developed countries, and we see that there is accommodation that is made for these people. Cancer is not the end of the road. Mental illness is not the end of the road. Disability is not the end of the road.
Right. Right. And a lot of times it starts from childhood and in schools, the perception and what parents how parents communicate with their children. One of the things that I pointed out in one of the articles is
Mm-hmm.
that there. I was thinking of Guyana, and I know Pauline. There's a professor at UG who did some work on um, on family violence and so on. And there's a link between family violence and mental health stress.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a need for parents and guardians to their education in recognizing symptoms, and I could give some examples. Sometimes there may be a child in a home, let's say a preteen, and the child is withdrawn for whatever reason. The child
Right.
experienced some sort of trauma. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and let's say the parent is asked, or the guardian is asked about the child. How come Judy always in the corner by herself and she
Yes.
don't interact and so on? And the
Correct.
mother may say, "Oh, she's just quiet. Don't worry, she's all right." Right?
Yeah.
Cough
Yeah.
it down, right?
Uh-huh.
And that's an example of where parents themselves, they're not only protective, but they are not open to really recognize some of the possible symptoms of psychological wellness. So this is another thing.
Ignorance, or you think it's ignorance, or it's just or just trying to ignore the fact that this could be something that is struggling with?
Avoidance. Yeah. No, I wouldn't say it's ignorance at all. It's ignoring it and being trying to be protective. You know, and the child is just quiet. I mean, the child may be quiet, but then if it's something that's going on and on, you know, it can be problematic. You know, so that's something that we should be looking at. You and I had this conversation some time ago, and I asked the question whether attempted suicide is still considered a crime in Guyana, and you said that's no longer so, right?
About 2 years ago, they passed the suicide prevention bill, and so attempted suicide now is no longer illegal. And you know, one of the things I've said about the bill is that I don't think that the bill creates the framework for removing that stigma, because you still have the police force up until, well, still is the 911, and up until recently, as you've pointed out, I think in a memo you sent to me, that you would call 911 and you would try to report an issue. And we had the same issue happen about a few weeks ago on the highway Yarra Cabra. And so they called 911. The police got on the phone. Police says, we can't do nothing about this. Call 914. You call 914, 914 says, well, they don't answer. So then, you know, this is what I'm saying, that the bill doesn't account for the structures in place. If you call 911 in the United States, you don't get onto the police. You call 911 and somebody answers, a group of people answers, and they get you the police if you need it, or the fire, or if there's violence, or there is whatever it is. You know, I remember I was driving from Wichita to Oklahoma, and the train actually had a problem, which it kind of, sometimes the trains, they derail a bit. You can't see it, but they derail off of the rail. And if they derail, then you can't, the trains can't move. So they have to go back and forth until they find the rail. But a long story short, this happened for 3 hours. I'm sitting there. You call 911, and 911 now makes contact with the train service. You know, and that's what 911 is supposed to be, the conduit, and 911 is not supposed to be enforcement. And so that's the problem we're having with the health bill. Also, the health bill doesn't put a lot of emphasis on stigma. We're still seeing, again, like you and I are discussing in context, large amount of stigma attached to mental illnesses, and in some cases it's a personal responsibility, but in cases we have to create the environment for people who are experiencing stigma. You have any comments to make about that?
Well, yeah, you're right. It calls for, I believe there should be not a commission per se, but a group of folks, including professionals in the field, economists. It can include economists, social workers, psychologists, and so on. Should really have a sort of a committee to discuss these issues, you know, whereby we have different ideas, different professions, you know, pooling their resources and coming up with solutions. And a lot of this, as I said, it should begin in the schools. It should begin in the schools, you know. So yeah, there's so much models that we can draw from.
Talking about the schools, you know, you've mentioned in your article that corporal punishment could have a lasting effect on the mental health of kids, right?
Yes.
And so I wanted to actually pull up the actual aspect that you were discussing about it. If you give me 1 second, so we could somewhat draw context to what our discussion is within the article.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to. Okay, so you said this. That nonetheless, some families need help in responding adequately to mental challenges, which are often a causal factor in disputes. The inability to recognize symptoms could lead to confusion and thwart effective remedial efforts. At times, children's behavior may be symptomatic of a mental health problem, signaling the need for parental guardian healthcare education to guide effective intervention. Relative to this matter, Caribbean parents tend not to see corporal punishment as abuse. Some analysts view this belief as endemic to the culture, notably in the Caribbean communities where child laws are enforced. Children immigrants have endured penalties for violation. What
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that? And specifically, I wanted to ask. As this created some issues because I remember when I growing up, we talk about corporal punishment. It means putting you in line.
Yes.
But what are the mental? Can you go deep into showing us how when we beat a child, in some cases it becomes very abusive? How that along the cycle of a child's life can drive mental illnesses.
Yeah, it can instill fear.
Mm-hmm.
It can it can impact the child's decision making process, not knowing what he or she should do or what would be accepted, and things like that. Because a lot of times, corporal punishment is 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 inflicted for things that the parent does not approve of, or is something that the parent might be embarrassed about, and the parent himself, and it may be a traditional thing where the parent himself or herself may have experienced corporal punishment as a child, and so they see it as an acceptable form of discipline, and sometimes it's difficult to reverse that, you know. But and so that's why consideration should be given to how do we um, how do we help parents? It's not only the child. How do we help parents? As a matter of fact, I thought corporal punishment had become um, not accepted in schools in the Caribbean anymore. Is that something recently?
I know that there have been some talk about it, but we can see. So it's not illegal in Guyana,
Uh-huh.
but it says that the Juvenile Justice Act of 2018 explicitly prohibits it as a disciplinary measure within penal institutions, meaning it's unlawful to use corporal punishment on children in juvenile detention centers or sentencing as a crime. However, corporal punishment may still be legal in the home, depending on the interpretation of the law.
Yeah, very vague interpretation of the law. So you leave the interpretation to the parent or the guardian.
You could still get a
that that could be dangerous, so yeah, it can lead to some problems, and psychologically it could be psychologically damaging. That's the thing to the child. The child could develop inhibitions, being timid, being afraid to express himself or herself. So all of these issues are very important. So I would say intervention is important, not from a reparative perspective, but starting early in terms of helping parents with the parenting process. But you have to be careful because remember, a lot of habits are culturally embedded, in us. And in order to change our approach, in terms of dealing with our children, some parents will tell you, well, I know what's right for my child, that kind of thing,
Right.
So,
It's a tough line that you straddle with.
yeah. So the intervention must be conscious of the kind of resistance that professionals would have. But what I'm saying is that parents should be involved in the process of helping them with the parenting process. That's parents must be involved in a humane way and culturally sensitive way also, because you don't want to tell people that you can't do this, you can't do, and they've been doing it for a while. It calls for a conversation and looking at the pros and cons. That kind of.
Yeah. So we add into that. You in the second paper, part 2, you noted that counseling educator Heather Vinner found that Caribbean adults are reluctant to admit having problems or seek help due to stigma and shame.
Yes.
They value discussing cultural issues, but prefer therapists who are similar to them in ethnicity, race, culture, and gender.
Yes.
Why do you believe that Caribbean people have this averse to admitting having problems? Is this something inherent to us? Are we just different from the rest of the world?
Well, it's a matter of trust and a matter of feeling comfortable with your own. It is not unique to Caribbean parents or guardians. It happens in other societies also. But this particular social scientist found that with an actual research that she did, that tendency is to trust your own. It's a matter of trust and being suspicious of outsiders. And it also depends on how the child was socialized. There's some parents would say, don't talk to strangers, and saying don't talk to strangers is fine, but sometimes the child may interpret that as don't talk to anybody outside of this house, that kind of thing, and it can instill fear in the child, and so we grow up with that kind of mentality and not trusting outsiders, just trusting folks from the in group. And that is why it is so important to have education, both socially and academically, of other cultures and the society at large, and have a sense of your contributing to your own development with guidance,
Right.
trusting and so on. So some parents need help with that.
But
Remember, go ahead.
Us as adults talking about our problems, I've heard that people say, and I've heard there's a correlation that, back in slavery, you just had you couldn't complain about anything. You couldn't say anything. All you had to do was just take your licks, and go. And then to some extent in indentureship, you were brought from a different country into some harsh conditions. And all you had to do was survive. Do you believe that, particularly, being a multi-ethnic society, do you believe that is sort of a product of where we are right now, not being very open about it? Because, in America, I know, you can meet somebody on the airplane and you can learn their whole life history. But in Guyana, you sit next to somebody, for a while, and you barely would know a lot. So what is the opening that we have is more open in other societies, and in Guyana, you think that maybe historical events have probably had a role to play in this?
Yeah, definitely. And in some ways, we are sort of a closed society. That is being, and especially today, that is being, I don't want to use the word eroded, but it's being affected by things like the internet. where
Right.
people, in terms of expressing themselves, they have an outlet to do that,
Mhm.
rather than um, having to do it in terms of talking to other people. They can text other people and so on. Um, but there's some negative aspects of that too. The whole issue of bullying, it's
Right.
been a problem among children. Yeah. So yes, the historical experience definitely impacts on our behavior and our children's behavior and how we parent also, definitely.
Yeah, so just notice that we have some viewers both on YouTube and Facebook, and just remember that at any point in time now, if you have a question or comment, you're free to make it. We know Donna does. She said this is a very good topic. She sends her best wishes, Dr. Matthews, to you. You also have Roxanne Thomas saying that this is a very good topic as well. And so we're willing to take both any questions you guys may have, or any comments that you would like to make relative to the topic of discussion right now. So please go ahead and make those as you see fit. Dr. Matthews, we're going to continue. I want to, we've been talking about mental illness, economical development, and we know Guyana is a multicultural society, and you've eloquently elaborated on this. Uh, it comes with a lot of great advantages, right? Which is the food, the clothes, our customs, and so forth. But there are some disadvantages of multiculturalism, particularly when it comes to mental health. Um, what are some of those, and can you elaborate on that a bit for us?
The advantages with mental
And the
health.
advantages and disadvantages of multiculturalism on mental health or mental illnesses.
Yeah. Well, there's a difference in terms of rural urban behavior also, whereby rural residents tend to be more closed and less interactive with others, especially outsiders, whereas the folks who live in the urban area tend to be more open. So that's one difference. And whereas in the past, let's say in Guyana, the two major ethnic groups, East Indians and,
Correct.
and blacks, Afro-Guyanese.
Mhm.
The, the the tendency in the history shows that because of the culture and the changes and the development and the work experience, um, the Af- Afro-Guyanese tend to be like it. Let's look at Georgetown, 25 years ago, or even longer than that.
Mhm.
You hardly used to see East Indians in the urban areas, right?
Correct. All
And
right.
and they were mostly in the rural areas, and they tended to be more conservative. Um, they tended it to be more inclusive, whereas with the Afro-Guyanese, um, they were more accustomed to the urban areas and so on, and so they tend to be more outgoing, right?
Mhm.
And then if we look at the history of Guyana too, in terms of the political divisions, that also shaped some attitude, in terms of how they protect themselves, how we protected ourselves, and the extent to which we react with one another. So there's so many facets in society that impact on our behavior, whether it's conservative or more outgoing, whether it's more trusting or more, protective and things like that. So, and then you have to look at cultural beliefs too.
Mhm.
People who are more religious, they tend to follow religious values, whereas people who are not as religious, they're more outgoing. So it's the religious differences, the politics that's involved, and the ethnicity.
So you say that their multiculturalism sort of it hurts us more than help us.
Yeah, I don't know. There are advantages in some
Right.
ways, definitely. But you know, one of the things, you know, you'd ask me to say a few words on the diaspora, and as I studied the Guyanese diaspora, one of the
Mm.
points I made is that just as how it is the motto of one Guyana is something that's promoted. One people, one nation, and one destiny. I mean, they sound real good, and they're good ideals to
Right.
work toward. But in reality, if I look
Mhm.
at the diaspora, the Guyanese diaspora, say in New York, right?
Right. Hmm.
The Guyanese diaspora is not a monolith.
Correct.
It is not a monolith.
Half
But
of them live in Jamaica, Queens
there
area,
you go,
and the other half
into
live in.
Guyana and so on. Yeah, yeah. Um, you know, but when and I don't want to get into politics here, but when certain people come to to New York, for example, you know,
Correct. Uh-huh.
talk about one diaspora,
Mm-hmm.
it's still important for them to visit separately the two diasporas.
Correct. And then,
You
and
know
then
what I'm saying?
the people in the Bronx might also be offended too.
There you go. There you go.
You
So,
know.
it's very interesting when you talk about race relationships, the diaspora, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. So the elephant is in the room, as I say, is trust.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the extent to which the two groups don't really trust one another. I mean, that's part of it. I'm not saying that's the whole thing. You know, that's part of it, and it sort of keeps them apart. But on the other hand, so we can talk about the diaspora. Um, there are these organizations called hometown associations. Hometown
Right.
associations are, as you know, organizations that's formed in the diaspora, that's formed by people from the same village or who attended the same high school or
Correct.
who were the same workplace in Guyana. They
Mm.
migrate and then they form these organizations that are called hometown associations.
Right.
Colin, I tell you, based on my research, I have
Right.
found almost 400 of these organizations in North America alone,
Mm-hmm.
right? And growing. You
Right.
know, it's
Yeah. Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
right? And they perform a very important function. And of course,
Right.
they have some, you know, and they bring the culture of Guyana, you know,
Right.
to
Mm.
diaspora. And it's a sort of a thread that keeps groups together, right? And they
Mm.
support one another. The organization support one another. But what are
Mm.
the problems? One of the major problems now is
Mm.
succession. They're
Ah,
all having a problem finding new members, right?
right.
And
Mm.
one of the things I asked them, you know,
Mm.
some executive when I was doing my research, I said, "What does your mailing list look like?" So when you invite folks to a fundraiser, what does your
Mm.
mailing list look like? Do you know they have this? Many of them, some of them, have the same mailing list they had 25 years ago, right?
Right.
And
So
so, and
it's
then
not all inclusive then.
it's not
It's not
inclusive, right?
capturing. Right. Right.
And linked to this is the
Mm-hmm.
fact that some would say, "Oh man, when we have a cash bar for our fundraiser, we don't make as much money." Well, people are becoming older. The people they're
Yeah.
not drinking as much. How about that? You
Yeah.
know, right?
You also need to use more innovative ways such as social media. You got to reach out to a larger group of people and so forth.
Exactly.
Right.
So succession is a problem, but
Mhm.
there are possible solutions. Some of these organizations are using. You know, you
Mhm.
encourage the young people, give them some assignments within your organization, offer scholarships to the
Mhm.
children or grandchildren of your members, that kind of thing. So they're beginning to do that kind of to do that now. Okay.
So I know, we this is a great topic, and so sadly we have to wrap up. But I just want to ask you briefly. We as a diaspora contribute to about roughly about 600 million US dollars. So that is about if you look at it, 120 billion dollars to the Guyanese economy. You noted in many articles I've read from you, and even in your book, there's this tension that exists. Quickly, talk to us about this tension between the diaspora and the local population in Guyana, and maybe how can we remedy some of this, on both sides. I know it's a loaded question.
Yes,
we have. Or
yeah,
so.
there's definitely been a tension. Again, I begin by saying it's one of trust. You know, it's one of trust. So there's a trust issue there. Even though the diaspora contribution to quote unquote development in Guyana is something that's well known, and it comes in different forms. Remittances, right? Sending remittances is something that has been going on with diasporas for a long time, still is. But there are other contributions that the diaspora makes. For example, and there's some frustration. There has been some frustration. So I've heard folks from the diaspora organization say that, you know, when we send equipment to school or whatever, somehow it's taken a long time to clear from customs and that kind of thing, and that kind of frustrating. These little things, when they add up, so that's one of the problems. Also, there's some who believe that when, you know, they would like to go back home to contribute, whether through, you know, employment or open a business and so on. And some people have complained, I found in my research, that they are not really welcomed with open arms. Sometimes and also the work acumen is different. You know, Guyana and other development societies is more relaxed. So people who have been trained in so-called developed countries tend to have different business-like acumen. So there's friction when it comes there. You know, and some people would say, well, it's who you know, it's not what you know. So all of these little things add up, and it causes friction. One of the other things I want to say specifically in terms of healthcare and the diaspora. The diaspora organizations have been involved in you know, contributing in terms of folks going down and giving their time, doing a skit here or there, or sending materials for the healthcare field and so on. But one of the issues
so we have to wrap up.
Yeah, let me just make this one point. One of the major problems, it seems, that when let's say someone goes down to Guyana, takes some medical equipment or whatever, or they volunteer their services in a medical facility, and they leave for a while and then they go back 6 months later. There's no follow-up locally. And that has been very frustrating to a lot of folks who are making contribution to their home country. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Matthews. This has been great. And thank you so much for your insights and to economic development. We talk about mental health and the role of the diaspora. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on YouTube, Facebook. And hope you're staying warm in New York. And have a great day. Have a great night, sorry. And thank you for joining Health Inside Out. Have a good night.
When I hear how much bush she had, I moved up till I couldn't even talk. She started to call from Jam Street corner, and never stopped to reach Orange Walk. The woman had me so surprised that I didn't know what to do. That the girl come and give me a cup in the eye, and I didn't even know what's who.
I went to a dance at Clarendon, me and a big fat thing named Palm.
Club Twilight presents Sunday 26th January, the big people after lunch in Oldies Bacchanal. Yes, at Club Twilight, Sideline Down, Buxton North. Music by Supercat One Man Band, Camps Audio, Disco Baby, and popular DJs. Check it out. It's the big people after lunch oldies bacchanal at Club Twilight. Sunday 26th January. It's gonna be a back in time movie.